The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked quietly through the East Gardens. At 12 years old, he had grown taller over the summer, his blonde hair catching the golden light as he moved with the careful grace that had been instilled in him since childhood. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The castle grounds buzzed with their usual activity. Gardeners tended to the rose beds that his great-grandmother had loved so dearly, their voices carrying softly on the autumn breeze. Kitchen staff hurried between buildings, preparing for the day's meals, while security personnel maintained their watchful presence throughout the estate. George had always been fascinated by the people who worked at the castle. Unlike many children his age who might take such service for granted, he had developed a genuine curiosity about their lives, their families, their stories. His mother, Catherine, had always encouraged this interest, often reminding him that true nobility came not from titles but from how one treated others, especially those who worked hard to serve. As he rounded the corner near the staff quarters, George noticed something unusual. A guard he recognized but had never spoken to was sitting on a stone bench, his head in his hands. The man's shoulders were shaking slightly, and George could tell he was trying very hard not to cry. The guard was Thomas Whitmore, a man in his early 40s who had served at various royal residences for nearly 15 years. George had seen him countless times during his walks, always standing at attention, always professional, always with a kind nod when their paths crossed. Thomas had kind brown eyes and graying hair at his temples, and George had often wondered about his life beyond the uniform. George hesitated for a moment. His royal protocol training told him to continue walking, to maintain the appropriate distance between himself and the staff. But something deeper, something his mother had taught him about compassion, made him pause. He looked around to ensure they were relatively alone, then slowly approached the bench. "Excuse me?" George said softly, his young voice carrying a gentleness that belied his royal status. "Are you all right, Mr. Whitmore?" Thomas looked up, startled. He quickly wiped his eyes and began to stand, snapping to attention as protocol demanded. "Your Royal Highness, I apologize. I didn't see you approaching." "Please forgive me for—" "No, please," George said, holding up his hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both authoritative and kind. "Please sit. I was just wondering if you're okay. You seemed upset." Thomas remained standing, his training warring with the genuine concern he saw in the young prince's eyes. "I'm fine, Your Royal Highness. Just a personal matter. Nothing that should concern you." George studied the man's face, noting the redness around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. He had learned to read people, a skill that would serve him well in his future role, and he could see that Thomas was far from fine. "May I sit with you for a moment?" George asked, gesturing to the bench. Thomas looked around nervously. "Your Royal Highness, I don't think that would be appropriate. If someone were to see—" "Then they would see a young man having a conversation with someone who might need a friend," George interrupted gently. "Please, just for a moment." There was something in the prince's tone, a maturity that went beyond his years, that made Thomas slowly sink back onto the bench. George sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance but close enough to convey that he was truly present. "I lost my daughter yesterday," Thomas said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Not lost as in she died," he added quickly, seeing the alarm in George's eyes. "Lost as in, she said she never wants to see me again." George felt his heart clench. Even at 12, he understood the pain of family conflict, though his own experiences paled in comparison to what this man was clearly going through. "I'm sorry," George said simply. "That must hurt terribly." Thomas looked at the young prince with surprise. He had expected royal platitudes or perhaps for George to excuse himself and leave. Instead, he found genuine empathy in those young blue eyes. "She's 16, Thomas continued, finding himself opening up to this unexpected listener. "My Emma. Her mother and I divorced 3 years ago. It was difficult. Emma blamed me for the marriage ending, and yesterday she told me she's tired of pretending to care about our weekend visits. She said she's old enough to choose not to see me anymore." The pain in Thomas's voice was palpable. George, despite his young age, could sense the depth of a father's heartbreak. "Did you explain your side to her?" George asked carefully. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "How do you explain to a 16-year-old that sometimes marriages fail even when both people try their best? How do you tell your daughter that you work long hours and weekends to pay for her school, her clothes, her future, when all she sees is that you're not there for her school plays and birthday parties?" George was quiet for a moment, processing this adult pain with the wisdom of someone far older than his years. "Maybe she doesn't need explanations right now," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe she just needs to know that you love her no matter what she says or how angry she gets." Thomas stared at the young prince, amazed by the insight coming from someone barely into adolescence. "You're very wise for your age, Your Royal Highness." "My mother always tells me that love isn't about being right," George said, remembering one of Catherine's many gentle lessons. "She says it's about being present and patient even when it's hard." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as a pair of swans glided across the distant pond. George found himself thinking about his own relationship with his parents, how fortunate he was to have their constant support and guidance. He couldn't imagine the pain of a child rejecting that love. "Have you tried writing to her?" George suggested suddenly. "Sometimes it's easier to say important things in a letter. My father writes me letters sometimes, even when we see each other every day. He says some feelings are too important for just speaking." Thomas considered this. "I wouldn't know what to say." "Maybe that's exactly what you should say," George replied, "that you don't know what to say, but you love her anyway. That you're sorry she's hurting and you're willing to wait until she's ready to talk again." The wisdom in these words struck Thomas deeply. Here was a 12-year-old boy offering counsel that cut straight to the heart of the matter. No complex strategies or adult rationalizations, just simple truth delivered with genuine care. "You know," Thomas said, looking at George with new respect, "your parents have raised a remarkable young man." George felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just think about how I would want my father to respond if I was angry with him. I think I'd want him to love me enough to wait until I wasn't angry anymore." A groundskeeper approached in the distance, and George knew their conversation would need to end soon. Royal protocol and Thomas's position both required discretion. "Mr. Whitmore," George said, standing up slowly, "I hope things work out with Emma. And if you ever need someone to listen again, I take this same walk most mornings around this time." Thomas stood as well, his posture straightening back into professional stance, but his eyes remained warm with gratitude. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. You've given me more help than you know." As George walked away, Thomas watched the young prince's retreating form with something approaching awe. In a world where royal protocol typically maintained strict barriers between the family and their staff, this boy had chosen compassion over convention. He had seen a person in pain and had simply responded as one human being to another. That evening, Thomas sat at his small kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. He began to write, "Dear Emma, I don't know what to say to make things better between us, but I love you anyway." Meanwhile, back at the castle, George lay in his bed thinking about the encounter. He wondered if he had done the right thing, if he had overstepped boundaries that existed for good reasons. But when he remembered the gratitude in Thomas's eyes, he felt certain that kindness was never wrong. His mother had always taught him that with privilege came responsibility, not just to the crown or the country, but to individual people whose lives intersected with his. Today had been his first real test of that lesson, and he felt he had passed. As sleep began to take him, George made a mental note to take his morning walk again tomorrow. Not because he hoped to encounter another crisis, but because he had learned something valuable about the power of simply being present for another person. The lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life, shaping the kind of king he would someday become. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities for compassion. But tonight, a young prince slept peacefully, knowing he had made a difference in one person's world, and a grieving father found hope in the simple wisdom of a child who chose kindness over protocol. 2 weeks had passed since George's conversation with Thomas Whitmore, and the young prince found himself eagerly anticipating his morning walks. True to his word, he had continued his routine through the East Gardens, though he hadn't encountered Thomas again in quite the same circumstances. He had seen him at his usual posts, and they had exchanged polite nods, but George respected the man's professional duties and didn't intrude. This particular morning brought unexpected excitement to the castle. A group of international diplomats and their families were visiting for a cultural exchange program, and among them were several children close to George's age. His parents had encouraged him to participate in the day's activities, viewing it as valuable preparation for his future diplomatic responsibilities. The autumn air was crisp as George made his way to the grand drawing room where the families were gathering. He was dressed in a smart navy suit that his mother had chosen, appropriate for the formal occasion, but not so elaborate as to intimidate the visiting children. As he walked through the corridors, he could hear the buzz of multiple languages and excited chatter. When he entered the drawing room, George was immediately struck by the diverse group before him. Children from Japan, Brazil, Kenya, and Norway stood somewhat awkwardly with their parents, clearly awed by the grandeur of their surroundings. The adults were engaged in polite conversation with his parents and various palace officials, but the children seemed uncertain about how to behave in such a formal setting. George's natural empathy immediately kicked in. He remembered his own first experiences at state functions, how overwhelming they could be, even when you were accustomed to royal life. He approached the group of children with a warm smile, introducing himself simply as George and asking about their countries and interests. Within minutes, the formality began to dissolve. 10-year-old Yuki from Japan shyly shared her love of horses, lighting up when George told her about the royal stables. 12-year-old Carlos from Brazil, initially intimidated by the palace setting, relaxed when George asked about football and admitted he was terrible at the sport despite being English. Amara from Kenya, 11 years old and clearly intelligent beyond her years, engaged George in a discussion about wildlife conservation that impressed the watching adults. As the morning progressed, the group moved through various activities. They toured the state rooms, participated in a traditional English tea ceremony, and even had a lesson in royal protocol that turned into more of a game than an educational session. George found himself naturally taking on the role of host, making sure no child felt left out or overwhelmed. It was during the garden tour that the incident occurred which would become the heart of the day's most meaningful moment. The group had been walking through the same East Gardens where George had encountered Thomas, when young Ingrid from Norway, only 8 years old and the smallest of the group, suddenly stopped walking. She had been quiet for most of the morning, clearly overwhelmed by the experience. "I want my mama," she whispered in accented English, her eyes filling with tears. Her mother was back at the drawing room with the other adults, engaged in political discussions deemed too complex for the children's tour. The other children looked uncertain, not knowing how to respond to their new friend's distress. The palace guide, Mrs. Henderson, approached with professional kindness, but was clearly concerned about disrupting the scheduled activities. George, however, immediately knelt down to Ingrid's level, his instinctive compassion overriding any concern for protocol or scheduling. "Hey, Ingrid," he said gently. "I understand. Sometimes these big places can feel scary when you're not used to them. Would you like to sit down for a minute?" Ingrid nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. George looked around and spotted the same stone bench where he had sat with Thomas 2 weeks earlier. Something about the location felt right, as if it was becoming a place where genuine human connection trumped formality. "Mrs. Henderson," George said, looking up at the guide, "could we take a short break here? Maybe the others could explore the rose garden just over there while Ingrid and I have a chat?" Mrs. Henderson looked uncertain. The schedule was carefully planned, and deviations required approval from higher authorities. But something in the young prince's manner, the same quality that had made Thomas feel comfortable opening up, made her nod. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Children, shall we look at the roses? We'll be just over there." As the group moved away, George sat beside Ingrid on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance but positioning himself so she felt supported rather than alone. "You know," George said conversationally, "the first time I had to do something really formal and scary, I threw up on my shoes." Ingrid looked at him with surprise, a small giggle escaping despite her tears. "Really?" she asked. "Really," George confirmed solemnly. "I was 7, and we were at a big dinner with lots of important people. I was so nervous about using the right fork and saying the right things that I made myself sick. My father had to carry me out and everyone stared." "Were you embarrassed?" Ingrid asked, her tears slowing. "Terribly," George admitted. "But you know what my mother told me afterwards? She said that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do things even when you are scared. And she said that anyone worth impressing would understand that I was just a little boy trying his best." Ingrid considered this wisdom, her small face serious with thought. "But you're a prince. You're supposed to be good at these things." "Being a prince doesn't make me different inside," George explained patiently. "I still get scared, still miss my parents when they're not around, still sometimes want to run away when things feel too big or too hard. The difference is that I've had practice dealing with those feelings." From across the garden, Thomas Whitmore watched this interaction with growing amazement. He had been assigned to security for the diplomatic event and had witnessed the entire morning's activities. Seeing the young prince's natural leadership with the visiting children had been impressive enough, but watching him now, providing comfort to a frightened child with such genuine empathy, was something else entirely. "What do you do when you miss your parents?" Ingrid asked. George thought for a moment. "Well, I remember that they love me and they're proud of me even when I'm scared, and I try to think about what they would tell me if they were here. Usually they'd tell me to be kind to others and to remember that everyone else is probably feeling just as nervous as I am." "Even the grown-ups?" "Especially the grown-ups sometimes," George said with a conspiratorial whisper that made Ingrid giggle again. "My father told me that when he was learning to be king, he used to imagine everyone in their underwear when he got nervous giving speeches." Ingrid burst into proper laughter at this image, covering her mouth with both hands. "That's silly." "Very silly," George agreed, smiling at her reaction. "But it worked, because it reminded him that everyone is just a person underneath all the fancy clothes and titles." Thomas found himself smiling as he watched from his post. The young prince's approach was so natural, so unforced. He wasn't talking down to the child or offering empty platitudes. He was simply sharing his own vulnerability in a way that made her feel less alone. "Do you think your mama is worried about you?" George asked gently. Ingrid nodded. "I wanted to be brave like she told me to be, but everything is so big and fancy, and I don't know the right words to say." "You know what?" George said, standing up and extending his hand to her. "How about we go find your mama and tell her what a brilliant job you're doing? Because from where I sit, you're being incredibly brave. You came to a new country, met new people, tried new things, and when you felt scared, you were honest about it. That takes real courage." Ingrid took his hand, standing up with renewed confidence. "Will you come with me to find her?" "Of course," George said. "And on the way, maybe you can tell me more about Norway. I've never been there, and I'd love to hear about your home." As they walked back toward the main group, Ingrid chattered about fjords and northern lights, her earlier distress completely forgotten. George listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made her feel important and knowledgeable. Mrs. Henderson watched their approach with relief, but it was Thomas Whitmore who felt the deepest impact of what he had witnessed. Here was a boy, raised with every privilege imaginable, who instinctively understood that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than standing above them. When they reunited Ingrid with her mother, the Norwegian diplomat's eyes filled with grateful tears as her daughter excitedly recounted her conversation with the prince. The woman tried to thank George formally, but he simply smiled and said he was glad Ingrid was feeling better. The rest of the day proceeded smoothly, with all the children now completely at ease in George's presence. By the time the families departed that evening, lasting friendships had been formed, and several parents remarked to William and Catherine about their son's exceptional maturity and kindness. That night, as George prepared for bed, his mother sat on the edge of his bed as she had done since he was small. "I heard you had quite an eventful day," Catherine said, smoothing his hair. Ingrid was scared. George said simply, "I just remembered being scared too." Catherine smiled, her heart swelling with pride for this remarkable boy. "You handled it beautifully. Your father and I are very proud of how you made all the children feel welcome." "Mama," George said thoughtfully, "do you think it's okay that I care more about people feeling comfortable than about following all the rules exactly right?" Catherine considered this question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that the most important rule of all is to treat people with kindness and dignity. Everything else is just details." George smiled, satisfied with this answer. As his mother kissed him good night and turned off the light, he reflected on the day's events. He thought about Ingrid's courage in admitting her fear, about the way the other children had rallied around her once they saw it was okay to be imperfect, about Thomas watching from his security post with what George was learning to recognize as respect rather than mere protocol. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between rigid formality and human connection. But tonight, George fell asleep knowing that he was beginning to understand what kind of leader he wanted to become. One who ruled not through fear or distance, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating every person as worthy of dignity and care. In his modest flat across town, Thomas Whitmore was writing another letter to his daughter Emma, inspired by what he had witnessed that day. If a 12-year-old prince could find the courage to be vulnerable and authentic, perhaps a father could too. The first snow of winter had begun to dust the grounds of Windsor Castle when George encountered Thomas Whitmore again, though this time the circumstances were entirely different. It had been nearly 2 months since their first conversation, and the young prince had often wondered about Thomas's daughter Emma and whether his letter had helped bridge the gap between them. George was returning from his weekly riding lesson, his cheeks flushed from the cold and his spirits high from a particularly good session with his horse Chancellor. As he walked through the stable courtyard, he noticed a small commotion near the staff entrance to the east wing. A teenage girl with dark hair was arguing with Thomas, who was clearly trying to maintain his professional composure while dealing with what appeared to be a very personal situation. "I don't care if you're working, Dad," the girl was saying, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "You sent me this letter asking me to talk, so here I am." "We're talking." George recognized the pain and frustration in both their voices and realized this must be Emma. His first instinct was to walk away and give them privacy, but something about the scene concerned him. Thomas looked genuinely distressed, caught between his duty to maintain professional standards and his desperate desire to reconnect with his daughter. As George hesitated, he saw Mrs. Patterson, the head of household staff, approaching the pair with a stern expression. The woman was known for running a tight ship and had little patience for personal matters, interfering with work duties. George knew that Thomas could face serious consequences if this situation escalated. Without fully thinking through the implications, George changed direction and walked purposefully toward the group. "Emma," he called out, hoping he had remembered her name correctly. "You must be Thomas's daughter. He's told me so much about you." All three adults turned to stare at him in surprise. Thomas looked mortified that his family drama was playing out in front of the young prince. Mrs. Patterson appeared confused about why Prince George was involving himself, and Emma looked stunned that a member of the royal family knew who she was. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas began, his voice tight with embarrassment, "I sincerely apologize for this disruption. Emma was just leaving." "No, I wasn't," Emma said defiantly, though her voice had lost some of its edge now that she found herself in the presence of royalty. "I came here to talk to my father, and I'm not leaving until we do." George could see Mrs. Patterson preparing to intervene, and he knew that once she did, any chance for Thomas and Emma to reconcile would be lost in a flurry of disciplinary measures and professional protocols. "Mrs. Patterson," George said, turning to the head of household with the same natural authority he had displayed with the diplomatic children. "Would it be possible for Thomas to take a short break? I was hoping to speak with him and Emma about something important." Mrs. Patterson looked puzzled, but found herself nodding almost involuntarily. There was something in the young prince's manner that made dissent seem impossible. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," she said, though her expression clearly indicated she had no idea what was happening. "Thomas, you have 15 minutes. As Mrs. Patterson walked away, still looking confused, George turned to Emma with a gentle smile. "I'm George," he said simply, extending his hand as if she were a visiting dignitary rather than a distraught teenager causing a scene. Emma stared at his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it tentatively. "I know who you are," she said. "Everyone knows who you are." "Well, now I know who you are too," George replied warmly. "Your father talks about you often. He's very proud of you." Emma glanced at Thomas with surprise, clearly not expecting this information. "He's proud of me?" she asked skeptically. "He barely knows me anymore." "That's not true," Thomas interjected quietly. "Emma, I know everything about you. I know you're top of your class in literature, that you volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends, that you want to study veterinary medicine. I know you hate mushrooms and love thunderstorms, and that you still sleep with the stuffed elephant I gave you when you were 3. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained defiant. "Knowing facts about me isn't the same as being their dad." George listened to this exchange with the same careful attention he had given to diplomatic briefings. He was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. This wasn't simply about a teenage tantrum or a neglectful father. This was about two people who loved each other deeply, but had lost the ability to communicate that love effectively. "Emma," George said gently, "would you mind if we sat down somewhere more comfortable to talk? I know a place where we can have some privacy." He led them to a small garden alcove that was sheltered from both the wind and prying eyes. It wasn't the same bench where he had first encountered Thomas, but it had the same quality of peaceful intimacy that seemed to encourage honest conversation. "Thomas has told me how much he misses you," George began once they were settled. "And Emma, I can see how much you've missed him too, or you wouldn't be here." I'm here because I'm angry, Emma corrected, but her voice lacked conviction. You can be both, George said simply. You can miss someone and be angry with them at the same time. I think that might be the hardest kind of missing there is. Emma looked at him with surprise. She had expected royal platitudes, or perhaps for him to excuse himself from such an awkward family situation. Instead, he was speaking to her as if she were an adult whose feelings mattered. You don't understand, she said, but less harshly than before. He chose this job over us, over me. When my parents got divorced, he could have found work closer to where Mom and I live, but instead he took a promotion that meant even more hours, even more time away. Thomas winced as if he had been physically struck. Emma, the promotion meant better pay, better benefits. It meant I could afford your school fees, your music lessons, the car your mother needed. I never asked for any of that, Emma burst out. I asked for you to come to my school play. I asked you to help me with my science project. I asked you to be at my birthday party instead of sending another expensive present I didn't want. George watched this exchange with growing understanding. This was the eternal struggle of parents trying to provide for their children while being present for them, complicated by divorce and the particular demands of Thomas's profession. Emma, George said carefully, can I tell you something about my father? She nodded, curious despite her emotional state. He has one of the most demanding jobs in the world, George continued. There are always meetings, always crises, always people who need his attention. And sometimes I get angry because I want him to just be my dad instead of everyone else's future king. Thomas and Emma both listened intently as George continued. But I've learned something about parents who work hard. Sometimes they make the wrong choice about what we need most. They think providing for us means working more when what we really need is just them. But that doesn't mean they love us any less. It just means they're trying so hard to be good parents that they forget the simplest way to do that. Emma was crying now, but quietly, thoughtfully. The thing is, George added gently, your father can't go back and make different choices. None of us can, but he can make different choices now, starting today, and so can you. Thomas looked at his daughter with desperate hope. Emma, if you tell me what you need from me, I'll find a way to make it happen. I'll request different shifts. I'll use my vacation days differently. I just want you to want to spend time with me, Emma interrupted, her voice breaking. Not because you have to, not because it's scheduled, but because you actually want to be with me. I want to matter more than your job. You do matter more, Thomas said, his own voice thick with emotion. You matter more than anything in the world. I took the promotion because I thought being able to provide for you was how I showed love. I thought if I could pay for your future, it would make up for missing your present. I was wrong. George felt his heart ache for both of them. This was love expressed poorly, not absence of love, and he could see that both father and daughter were finally beginning to recognize that. Emma, George said softly, what if you could help each other figure out how to do this better? What if instead of being angry about what hasn't worked, you could tell your father what would work? Emma wiped her eyes and looked at her father as if seeing him clearly for the first time in months. I don't need expensive presents, she said quietly. I need you to call me sometimes just to ask about my day. I need you to remember the things I tell you about my friends and my classes. I need to know that when you're here with me, you're actually here, not thinking about work. Thomas nodded earnestly. I can do that. I want to do that. And Dad, Emma added, her voice growing stronger, I need you to let me help sometimes too. When you're stressed about work or worried about money, I want to know. I'm not a little kid anymore. I can handle knowing when things are difficult. George smiled as he watched the barriers between father and daughter begin to crumble. This was what he had hoped for, not a perfect resolution, but a genuine beginning. "There's something else," Emma said, looking at George with gratitude. "Thank you for writing to him. Dad showed me your letter about love being patient and being present. It made me realize that maybe I hadn't been very patient either." George looked confused. "I didn't write your father a letter." Thomas smiled, understanding dawning in his eyes. "No, but you inspired him. After our conversation that morning, you gave me the courage to write to Emma honestly, to tell her I didn't know what to say, but that I loved her anyway." As the three of them sat in the garden alcove, surrounded by the gentle fall of snow, George reflected on the strange way that kindness seemed to multiply itself. His simple act of sitting with a troubled man had rippled outward, affecting relationships and lives in ways he never could have predicted. "Thomas," George said as they prepared to part ways, "I think your break time is probably up, but perhaps you and Emma could continue this conversation after your shift ends." "Actually," Emma said, standing up and straightening her jacket, "I was thinking maybe I could stay and watch Dad work for a while, if that's allowed. I've never really seen what he does here, and maybe it's time I understood this place that takes so much of his time." Thomas's face lit up with joy at this suggestion. "I'd love that if Prince George doesn't mind." George grinned. "I think that's a wonderful idea. And Emma, if you'd like, I could show you some of the more interesting parts of the castle that visitors don't usually get to see. Your father knows them all, but he probably can't leave his post to give tours." As they walked back toward the main building together, George felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with royal protocol or diplomatic success. This was the feeling his mother had told him about, the quiet joy that came from helping others find their way back to each other. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as George finally made his way back to his family's quarters. He found his parents in the sitting room, and when they asked about his day, he told them about Thomas and Emma, about second chances and patient love. William and Catherine exchanged a look of profound pride as they listened to their son describe his afternoon. They recognized that something fundamental was taking shape in George's character, an understanding that true leadership meant creating space for others to be their best selves. That night, as snow continued to fall outside his window, George thought about the day's events. In a few years, Thomas would retire from royal service, but George knew he would remember this man always, not as a guard who served the crown, but as a father who loved his daughter enough to be vulnerable, and as a reminder that behind every uniform was a complete human being with dreams and fears and family struggles. 6 months later, George would receive a wedding invitation. Emma was getting married young, but to a wonderful man, and she wanted to make sure Thomas would walk her down the aisle. In her note, she mentioned that she and her father had learned to talk to each other again, and that their relationship was stronger now than it had ever been. George would keep that invitation in his personal papers for the rest of his life, a reminder of the day he learned that sometimes the most royal thing you can do is simply help people find their way back to love. The lesson would shape every major decision he would make as a leader, every relationship he would build, every crisis he would navigate. For in that snowy garden alcove, a future king had discovered that true power lay not in commanding others, but in creating the conditions where healing and connection could flourish. It was a lesson that would serve not just George, but eventually an entire nation, as he grew into the kind of leader the world desperately needed. One who understood that at the heart of all governance, all diplomacy, all human endeavor was the simple revolutionary act of treating every person as worthy of dignity, respect, and love.